I'm curious how the transit map thing sort of first entered your life.
Probably my dad's influence. Growing up, he was really into railroad modeling and stuff like that. He was always like painting trains and stuff. And when I was younger, we went on a trip to London and I rode the London Underground, which is just a phenomenal transit system. And we went to the London Transit Museum, and there's a book there called Mr. Beck's Diagram or something like that. And it's about the history of the tube map, basically. And I bought that book, read it cover to cover, and just as a graphic designer, just instantly fell in love with the way that this complex system was condensed down and clarified into a very precise and easy to use tool. In 1933, I mean, that's a long time ago to come up with an idea like that really sort of changed the future of railroad mapping in a lot of ways. Almost every transit system around the world uses something that's based on the principles that he did then. And then a while ago, probably how long ago is it now? Like 15 years ago, I started up a little website called Transit Maps, where basically I just look at transit maps from around the world and I analyze them and I review them, all with the idea of making better maps myself, right? It was a personal project when I started, in terms of just trying to understand what make these maps tick, what works, what doesn't, what's successful, what's not successful. And, it's got a bit of a following now. I feel like I always like to say that I'm kind of like famous in a very niche circle. It's like I meet certain people and they're like, oh, you run the Transit Maps blog,
So you mentioned it was interesting to try to learn how to do them for yourself, like from a graphic artist standpoint. So like, what is your professional sort of day job, or is Transit Maps the thing you do full time?
No, Transit Maps is a side gig. I work as a graphic designer for a large multinational engineering firm, doing proposals and responding to RFPs and stuff like that. So we've worked on a lot of transit systems around the world. So there's an intersection there, obviously, of the interests, like my professional and my personal kind of intersect kind of nicely.
Cool.
I get to make maps at work, which is nice.
Nice. Yeah, I hear you. I want to ask you about your new project about Portland Streetcar History, but I also want folks to know a little bit more about the Transit Maps site. So it's more than just you posting interesting stories about transit maps. You sell maps too, right? And folks, if people don't remember, Cameron's a guy that I worked with to make the 1896 vintage Portland bicycle map that we're selling now. So how many maps are for sale?
On this printer. Yeah.
Oh, that's your printer.
That's my printer.
So funny. I thought it was a stove. I thought it was your.
No, that is
stove.
my printer.
That shows you how much I know. Yeah. So tell me about Transit Maps for folks that aren't familiar with it. You've got like what, several hundred vintage transit maps or remade. Like, how do you explain the sort of what you offer?
No, I sell maps that I design myself. So that's part of the experience from Transit Maps is I make and design these maps, and one of them is of Portland streetcars as it existed in 1915, but I also have like another one that's like, what if the interstate highway system was a subway map, this kind of thing. But then also, I will find high-res scans of old maps on the internet that are out of copyright, and I will digitally restore them, get rid of all the dust and scratches and all that kind of stuff, up the color balance, and sell those too. Yeah, pretty wide selection of maps from around the world. I've got New York, a couple from Paris, basically, I think it is around about 150 maps on offer now, something like that. But yeah, great Christmas gifts.
Yeah, cool. Okay, I want to move into the Portland Streetcar History project. It's another thing based on what you just said in terms of something that is a historical exercise to some degree, but we also still are opening new streetcar lines in the modern times right now. So there's kind of that duality that I think is interesting about your work. So tell me about the Portland Streetcar History project that you're working on.
So this is something that's just been batting around my head for a long time, in terms of I've made maps of the old streetcar routes in Portland before. And every time I want to do work on it, I have to go to the library and borrow 8 different books, or I have to look on the internet and find 4 or 5 different websites to get that information that I'm after. So in the end, I guess I was just like, well, what if I just started compiling all this stuff myself? And then I realized with my Multnomah County Library card, you have access to the Oregonian from day one. And with the right search terms, you can find all the old newspaper articles that tell you exactly when streetcar lines started operating, or when they stopped, or when their route changed, or all these different things. So basically, I've just been trawling through these archives and transcribing articles and finding old maps and putting it in a giant database. And it's been really interesting because, a lot of the stuff that we've assumed we know about streetcars is mostly right, but there's some stuff where the stuff that's published out there is not right. And I'm finding this out. There's a guy, Richard Thompson, who basically writes a whole bunch of books on Portland streetcar history. He's got 8 or 9 books out about it. And he's writing a new one at the moment. And he asked me to fact check some of his stuff. And I'm just like running through. I'm just like, these dates are all wrong. We need to, and I've got the newspaper articles to prove it.
Wow.
So we basically fact checked some of his work, and then he revised his manuscript based on that. So, which was great. I really enjoyed being able to sort of say, what we're putting out here is factually backed up by, newspaper articles from the time.
Yeah, and your interest. So I read on the site that you've got over 1,000 articles transcribed, information on 35 different streetcar companies and 68 different named city
Yeah.
streetcar lines.
Uh-huh.
I think a lot of people hearing this or watching this will know that Portland has a legacy, a really cool legacy of a lot of streetcar history. But for folks that don't, the streetcars here were just a massive, massive thing. Hence all the newspaper articles, right? Where anytime there was a change. But I'm curious, on your research, were you looking at just trying to find route changes and line locations, or were you also, or are you also finding articles about sort of more cultural things, or just more the impact streetcar had on people's lives, or maybe the politics around streetcar? You know what I'm saying? Is it both of those things?
I think it started out as a pure fact finding thing, like the actualities of the routes on the ground. But then it quickly turns into, yes, you can see the social impact and the way that the streetcar basically, in a lot of ways, defined the way Portland looks now. All the cool neighborhoods are all along the old streetcar lines. And then there's the whole thing about the stuff that they planned but never built. There's a whole other history there of like all the other streetcar lines they wanted to build. Because, you talk about these massive number of streetcar companies. What it was is at the beginning, there's the whole bunch of little separate ones, and they merge and they merge and they merge. And as they merged, the previous company might have had plans to extend a line somewhere, but they merged with another company who also had a line nearby. And they go, well, we don't need to build that line anymore because we're not competing with another company. So if there was ever a map of like all the stuff that they planned and never built, Portland would just be completely covered in streetcar lines. I mean, it was already a very dense network, but there would have been probably twice as much.
And when did that reach its peak? Is this 1930s or when?
Earlier. 1915 to 1920 would be the absolute peak of the streetcar.
Wow.
There was a little bit of a revival during World War II, just because of shortages of gas and tires and stuff like that. They actually dug out one of the streetcar lines. They buried it up in 1940, and then there was a rubber shortage for tires. So they basically dug up this old line and started running streetcars on it again, because they had some streetcars hanging out in the sheds that weren't being used.
Wow,
So
I've never heard that story.
The war did some strange things, but yeah,
That's
they
really
literally
cool.
dug out a line to reuse it.
Do you know where that was?
It was the bridge transfer line, which basically ran from the Broadway Bridge on the east side down to the Hawthorne Bridge on the east side, basically along Grand and Union.
So it had pavement over it, or they'd covered
They
it,
paved over it.
and they
And
ripped it up.
the reason they resurrected that one is because they'd recently abandoned like 3 lines, but the other 2 they'd already taken the copper wire down, and that one still had the wire up. And of course, copper wire was very rare during wartime. You couldn't just go, let's go and get some more copper wire. So they made do with what they had. So they reactivated that line. But yeah, there's photos in the newspapers of them jackhammering out the tracks.
Any idea how much rail is still underground?
Most of it.
Yeah.
I think, if you know what it looks like on the streets, you can tell. There's like a very distinctive laddering of the road surface because of the ties and the rail and the brick. Um, so if you're on Mississippi Avenue, it's really obvious there. If you're on Lombard going up towards St. John's, it's really obvious there. Obviously, there's that well-known exposed section of track on Morrison and 26th near the cemetery, which basically looks like it goes into someone's house. But there's two short sections of track there. If you're up on Pettygrove, Northwest Pettygrove, it's pretty much right there on the surface there. So there's evidence of it all over the place. It's most of it got buried. It was cheaper for the streetcar company to do it, and also I just found out the other day that sometimes it still acted as a return circuit to the generators, even though it was buried. So that basically it was still like electricity was still being transferred along the rails, because that's the way the old trolleys used to work. Is the electricity went along the trolley wire, got transferred to the motors, and the ground return was through the rails.
Interesting.
So they kept the rail in sometimes because it was doing that service for them.
And I bet now there's a lot of city officials who are cursing them for leaving it in.
Undoubtedly.
It's just costing millions and millions in maintenance. I'm sure everybody hearing this knows, that laddering effect you talked about is just brutal on a bicycle. And where sometimes, especially on a lot of the streetcar streets aren't necessarily streets where we have bike lanes. These are like the commercial corridor streets. So we're kind of in the middle of the lane a lot of times. And it's like you feel that laddering for sure.
Yeah. So every so often they do take it out. Like I know when they repaved Lombard through actual St. John's, like through the middle of St. John's a couple of years ago, they took the track out there.
Yeah, that was exciting. I remember that. I think they posted on social media some pictures of the old rail. I bet now, I bet you're like going to get eager to kind of go out there and get your hands on some of it. Maybe just
whenever I hear that track is being exposed, I try and get out there. Like there was some late last year that was like down on 22nd and Tillamook down there. There was some work there that exposed it, and I went down with my tape measure and measured the gauge, and measured it, because the streetcar was required to maintain the road between the rails and for a foot on either side of it. That was like in their franchise. They were responsible for maintaining that. And this is part of why the streetcar company started going broke in the end, is because the fares weren't increasing, but their maintenance costs were going up.
Right.
So they were stuck at charging everyone 5 cents for a ride because that's what the franchise allowed them. But they had all this deferred maintenance on the road to do. But yeah, so it was down there, and the rails were still there, and the Belgian brick on either side was exactly 1 foot wide. Like I got the tape measure out and measured it. It's like the streetcar company's like, we're taking care of this and nothing more.
Nice. You mentioned that rising cost of maintenance of these lines. I've read that recently. Maybe it was an article that you put up, but that was interesting to me, that the rising cost of the lines and the fare revenue not keeping up was a big reason why the streetcar lines died. But I think is there a conventional wisdom out there, a general public thinking that somehow the rise of the automobile is the thing that did that? I was struck when you said the peak was early 1920s. And when we did a little research for our vintage bike map in 1896, I took a lot of pride in the fact that that map came before. I mean, cars weren't really sold until 1912 or so, I think, in Portland, 1913. So you could look and say, well, yeah, the maturation of the car market, cars are overwhelmed. There's also, of course, that story we know about car companies buying up some of the streetcar lines and then basically mothballing them to get rid of the competition. So is that an unexpected thing that you've kind of come to learn, especially about the Portland one, that it's not necessarily the rise of the automobile as much as it's this issue of maintenance getting so out of hand?
It is a combination of so many things. Like you hear people trot out, the streetcar conspiracy all the time, right? The GM bought up all the lines and sold it. Didn't happen here in Portland. Like, GM were not involved in the downfall of streetcars in Portland. They were, by the 1930s, they were seen as old-fashioned, out of date. They were unloved, unmaintained, and they just started gradually getting rid of them where they could and replacing them with trolley buses at first, and then gas buses, which were seen as modern and comfortable. And and you can literally see the attitude change to streetcars through the newspaper articles. Like at the beginning, it's all like, oh my goodness, another streetcar line, how exciting. And by the end, it's like, thank goodness that's gone.
Wow.
It's
Yeah.
like the public attitude towards them was changing drastically.
Yeah.
Um,
And that then makes it harder for officials to raise money. And then
right.
that's just a downward spiral. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you got a sense of that shift, but I also want to ask too if you came across any in any of the articles, if you can recall. Obviously, there were still. I mean, I know that the bike boom in America around the turn of the 19th century really went bust to some degree, but I'm sure there were still thousands and thousands of bikes in Portland at that time. And I'm just curious if you
Mhm.
had anything. And nowadays, everyone knows it's sort of a rite of passage that it's so common to crash on the existing both light rail and streetcar tracks that we have. Some of the ones you mentioned are the worst. The ones that are the light rail is a little easier to avoid sometimes because everybody
Yeah.
knows those main lines and there's only a few. But there's streetcar tracks, especially in Northwest, that are just running right where you would be on a bike. It's super
Yeah.
dangerous over there in the Pearl District, and so many people have crashed and so many broken bones. So, did you come across any articles ever that talk about that in the newspaper of that interface between bicyclists and streetcar tracks?
There are a couple I can think of. There's one from way back in 1890 or something like that, where we did have one cable car line in Portland that went up to Portland Heights from sort of Jefferson and 18th and went straight up the hill there. And of course, the thing with the cable line is it has the hole for the cable, the grip to go down to grab the cable underneath the line. And so some guy riding a bike fell into this slot and he wanted to sue the company. And the company basically said, well, you are riding a dangerous and defective bicycle and it's your fault.
Wow.
So, that was a fun one. And then, there is mention about the time of that map, 1896. The streetcar companies noted that they were losing customers to bikes.
Really? Wow.
Yes, they were like the bicycle craze, as
Mm-hmm.
it's called. This newfangled bicycle craze is basically taking riders away from the streetcar. So you got to remember, like the streetcars weren't ridiculously fast at the time. Like around 1890, they were kind of averaging like 8.5, 9 miles an hour. So it was better than walking, but not by much.
I mean, it's pretty much the same as it is now, right? They're
Well, yeah, because there was less traffic for them to deal with back then.
true.
But and sometimes in the franchise, it was actually written into the franchise the maximum speed limit that the cars could do
Mm.
in the city. Because
Mm.
the city council was obviously worried about
Well,
streetcars speeding through the streets.
Well, we've all seen those vintage photos where back then there were so many more people on foot too, and there was no concept of you must cross at the signal and jaywalking is bad. That didn't come till later.
Didn't come yet.
So
There's
people would
great
just step
videos
off. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they exited the streetcar in the middle of the road most of the time.
Right.
It didn't pull over to the side to let them off.
Yeah. Is there anything else? Any other interesting quirks or any other unexpected things you've come around? You've come to find out about Portland streetcars?
I think the most interesting stuff I find is the way all the companies merged together and formed new companies, and the things that got abandoned because of that. There was it would have been a second line up to St. John's if they hadn't merged together, and it would have taken this massive diagonal from basically Ockley Green up to like Willis and just straight
Columbia
across
Park,
the peninsula. Because the thing people don't realize is they look at these old maps and they think, oh, it looks just like Portland of today. All the roads are there and everything like that, and all the names are very similar. They're all just plats. They didn't exist. Like nothing was actually there. It was all like, this is marked out for future development.
Interesting.
Everything north of Killingsworth out to St. John's was a barren field. There was just nothing, And we look at these old maps and we think, oh, it's the same.
Yeah, interesting.
There was nothing there. So they basically said, oh, we're going to go this way. We're going to go big diagonal. Never got built because they merged.
Yeah.
But it would have changed the fabric of North Portland completely if they built it.
Yeah, for sure. And it still can change the fabric of certain parts of Portland where, we're opening up an extension of the Montgomery Park. We're going to get streetcar out to Montgomery Park. So have you had any talks with the current city folks about maybe having a Cameron Booth commissioned, I don't know, as a commemorative
I have
thing?
not. I watch these things with interest all the time. I think someone wrote to me the other day, and just like, how are they going to get this streetcar around the corner on Northrop and 23rd heading north? It's like, I don't see how it can work. And I'm just like, well, I hope they would have thought about that before they announced the extension. But it's interesting, or they're trying to retrofit, modern streetcar infrastructure into streets that aren't necessarily ready for it. I mean, streetcar on 23rd comes with its problems, right? 23rd's already a very busy commercial street with parking on both sides, and it's going to be interesting to see how that works running a streetcar along, because it's going to have to be, because that section's bi-directional, so they're going to have two bits of track, one in each travel lane, right? So that's basically, it's going to make 23rd pretty interesting.
Yeah, I can't wait to see how that all shakes out. So, okay, I love the new project you're working on. We didn't mention that it is actually a wiki, and I love that format just because of that. It's got everything is tagged and categorized, and it's very clean. So, highly recommend folks check out both Cam's transit map site, and Christmas is coming, so buy the vintage bike map, go on there and buy another cool map for the transit streetcar nerd lover person in your life, and check out the new Portland Streetcar History project. Thanks for talking to us about it, Cam, and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Good to talk to you too, Jonathan.